hop right on in. So, this will sort of be the first official lecture of the course. I find it, relatively irksome that this has to occur through a lecture video, as you'll likely come to find out. I'm very much a professor that enjoys being inside the classroom and getting at students in that capacity. So having to do this over the internet, so to speak, is not my preferred cup of tea, but we'll make it work, and we'll see if I can be at least a little bit interesting. So what this lecture video will really do is kind of introduce you to the course, introduce you to some of the core concepts that we will discuss in the course, and kind of introduce you to what we might call an economic way of thinking. The thing about fields, especially at the collegiate level, kind of higher education, is that we really want to start to develop specific frameworks of how to see things and how to understand things that come at it from that specific field's point of view. This is really where other fields are able to take advantage of each other by each having their own perspective. And you get a nice diversity of thought, and you get a nice diversity of approaches ultimately. And this is good. We need disciplines that have overlapping interests, but simultaneously are bringing different considerations to the fold. And so, we'll talk a little bit about that. And we'll talk more broadly about what microeconomics is, and then kind of tie this back into some of the big ticket stuff that we'll be covering throughout the class. So before we hop into some of the actual lecture, I want to talk a little bit about sort of how to be successful in the course. The big thing that I really need you to do is to really kind of do what I ask, in the sense that if I ask you to do a particular reading, just make sure you do it, especially when it comes to the interpretation and sort of consumption of material during lecture. There are times when it's really crucial that you perform some pre-lecture reading so that you come to the course with a certain level of enlightenment, such that you can understand what's going on in lecture, or maybe not understand, but simply have a greater appreciation for what's going on in lecture. Students sometimes can kind of blow off readings, and it really necessarily doesn't hurt their grade long term, because you can always sort of read before the exam. But in this particular class, it's crucial that you kind of read things and kind of build the course in a foundational sense, and sort of build upon topics. And so the course is really laid out in a very specific way. I have a relatively specific vision for the course, and that includes specific readings. So just make sure that you're getting to the readings that I ask you to do. I'll always let you know about them in advance, and I'll also make sure that they are either posted on Blackboard or you know where to track them down. Almost every reading will be posted to Blackboard, or you'll have a link that will be posted on Blackboard as well. The way it works is, in lecture, we sort of introduce you to concepts and definitions and theories and these various things. And then, they take what you read and kind of expound upon it. It's crucial, again, that you do that reading. That way, when you come to class, I can kind of take what you've read and then take you to that next level. That's often the difficult part. Students can read textbooks. You don't need me to read a textbook. But what you do, in a sense, need me is to then take from that reading the textbook, and now to that additional component of applying what you read in the textbook perhaps to your own life, or applying what you read in the textbook perhaps to other sort of parts of economic systems or political systems or whatever. The textbook certainly has its own examples, and I have mine as well. And so it's good for you to get kind of a collection of applications with respect to the material that you read about in the course. The assignments are there to kind of provide you with quantitative tools of economic understanding. This will be the part where the lab really comes in. So when you go to labs, you'll mostly talk about your assignments as well as the quantitative aspects of the lecture. So you'll take the sort of lecture material, which will often take a cursory look at the mathematical aspects of the ideas, and then in lab is really where you're going to absorb and get that sort of mathematical look at economics in a much more one-on-one sort of atmosphere, which is better to do that kind of technical work as opposed to sort of the discussion and things like that, which can take place in the lecture. And then what I want you to do is make sure that you're kind of always reflecting on what we learned in the class. Take what we learned in the class and think about it. Don't shy away from, considering and thinking about economics. In fact, you'll probably find yourself doing this naturally, in the course. But, it's something to kind of consider. In terms of understanding the material, the exams and the assignments, provide a bit of a barometer. They kind of tell us, where maybe the deficiencies are and or where the strengths are. You should approach those in that way. They are not, punitive. Oftentimes students see assignments and exams as kind of this punishment, that comes along with taking the course. But in reality, assignments and exams, are important in the sense that they tell me how you're doing, they tell me what you're understanding, and they tell me what you're not. And so this allows me to then come into class and help you along with those areas that you're not doing so well in, and sort of let you continue doing well in those areas that you're doing well in. So that's the sort of general layout of the course, not unlike any other course. So let's continue. All right. So the sort of basics behind economics, I'm not going to spend too much time on any of these, but just to kind of lay it out there, you have your microeconomics, you have your macroeconomics. Micro, as I talked about in the first lecture video, deals with sort of these more individual decisions. Macroeconomics is at the country level. So you're sort of talking about the economic performance, of a particular country, whereas microeconomics is really this broad set of economic fields where you're looking at all sorts of issues related to individual decision making, from profit maximization at the firm level, to cost minimization among insurance companies, to the ways in which state governments set budgets, so on and so forth, to the way in which countries engage in war, for example, can also be at times boiled down to a microeconomic conversation. So there's a lot of space here and a lot of potential conversations for us to have, and so it makes microeconomics an especially intriguing class. Macro is great as well, but they tend to bring different things to the table. And within economics, we have this sort of balance between theoretical economics and empirical, or what we would call statistical analysis of economic problems. So taking theories and testing them, using data to uncover truths about our economic world. In this course, we're going to do both. We're going to look at economic theory, and then we're going to look at the empirics, and use the empirics at times to critique the theory, which is precisely what we're doing. So in a sense, one of the things that I try to do for students is introduce you to that aspect of economics that appeals to the sort of scientific minds. In fact, this is in many respects simply the scientific method at work here. In an unfortunate sense, a lot of the models that we will talk about in course are what we call static models, or models that do not have a time component. The reality is, of course, that whether it's with respect to economics or politics or whatever, everything has a time component, and the time component becomes actually a very important component of these models. But because of the nature, specifically the quantitative nature of economics, we ultimately end up living in a more static world. So most of the models that we'll look at in class are static, even though we know we live in a more dynamic, time-variant world. We have to kind of make simplifying assumptions. So this is really one of the components of economics that gets a lot of criticism, while at the same time is exceedingly necessary. In economics, we distinguish between what we call normative questions and positive questions. Normative questions are questions that have a moral judgment sort of cased inside of them. Positive statements or positive economics are statements that are really just sort of about factual reality, sort of economic factual reality. So, for example, a positive economic statement would be, the current unemployment rate is 3.9%, for example. The normative component there could be someone to come along and say, well, the unemployment rate is 3.9%, and that's too high. or, not that anybody would ever say 3.9% unemployment is too high, but, it's applying any sort of normative judgment to a particular statement. Now, we distinguish between the two because they serve two separate purposes. Positive economic statements, sort of statements of the way things are simply an enlightenment of certain economic conditions. The unemployment rate is this. The industrial utilization in our economy is this. Productivity in our economy is this. They serve to kind of inform us as to the relative economic positions that we are facing. The normative statements really come at it from a little bit more of a policy perspective over what should we do about a particular situation. So, say during a recession when unemployment is very high, a positive economic statement might be unemployment is 6.7%. A normative economic statement would be that at 6.7% unemployment, workers are not doing well, which is applying a bit more of a judgment to that particular economic statistic. But you can see that in the context of even something like unemployment, it can be very useful for us to at times have normative positions. And we will certainly cover several different normative positions in the course, while at the same time kind of making sure that most of what we have to say, it comes from a more positive perspective, because the unfortunate nature is that normative considerations can sometimes bias our sort of analysis. And so we want to sort of be careful that when we do make normative statements, that they come from a perspective of, sort of looking at what the economic data has to say and drawing conclusions from it. And we'll talk more about this as we go through. And then kind of lastly, there is this sort of friction between what we might call mainstream microeconomics or mainstream economics or heterodox economics. Mainstream economics in sort of the modern era refers to a vein of economics that is essentially, relatively pro-market, but also understands that sometimes markets break down, and when they do, there is room for, positive policy intervention. Heterodox economics sort of has come to encapsulate a broad kind of perspective of economics that falls outside of the mainstream, and usually are with respect to economists that hold more, not anti-market, but they're more skeptical of markets. And so heterodox sort of economists find themselves not necessarily aligning with sort of Marxist perspectives of economics, but simply exploring Marxist perspectives in a way that historically mainstream economics has really shied away from. And heterodox has really kind of seen itself grow over the last couple decades. When we say sort of what's the percentage of mainstream economists versus heterodox economists, most economists are mainstream. Sort of probably 90-10-90, probably it's not a huge level of heterodox economics, but they sort of represent in the modern era, I think, an important component of it's not just, there's not just one way to see economics. There are actual several ways, and also within sort of types of heterodox that we might consider pro-market, you also have kind of free market economists who sometimes fall outside of the mainstream as well. So mainstream is a really large umbrella of economic thought with both kind of extreme pro-market economists and kind of extreme market skeptics on either side of that. Personally, I would consider myself kind of right in the middle, mainstream economist. I would consider myself a capitalist. I believe in markets. I think they're very important. At the same time, I'm skeptical that markets work all the time. In fact, we know that they do not. And so that's again another one of those frictions that we'll likely talk about in class. And I think you'll find that conversation to be really important. We're seeing in sort of the modern political era a great upheaval with a lot of the kind of the economic policy norms. Currently we have a Republican administration that, for example, is relatively anti-trade, which is a rebuke in many respects of long-held conservative views towards global trade, which has always been very sort of open, free trade. And so that's one component, and you sort of see those same feelings on the extreme left as well. Sort of Bernie Sanders also during his political campaign spoke very skeptically of international trade as this economic benefit. And so you have this really interesting sort of evolution of economic thought that kind of goes around these sort of conversations about mainstream versus heterodox economics. We don't get into this much in a class like this, but it will be something from time to time that I certainly sort of bring your attention to. Okay, so here's where we really start the course. This is really where we get into everything. Okay, so these are what I would call sort of foundational concepts, and we'll spend a few minutes talking about each as we go through, and really kind of talking about how they relate to the sort of nature of the course. All right, so incentives. Economists have this very boring statement, and every time I hear an economist say it, even I have to roll my eyes, although I find myself saying it all the time, which might mean that I roll my eyes at myself, which, may or may not be the most healthy thing to do. But anyway, so the basic statement is that incentives matter. Right? Just incentives matter. That is that humans respond to incentives, and therefore the incentives themselves matter. They cause us to behave in certain ways. They cause us to change our behavior, or they cause us to maintain our behavior. So incentives sort of work in a lot of different ways. And I think what's most interesting about incentives is not that they matter, but that they matter at times in counterintuitive ways, or they matter in ways that we didn't necessarily predict. And that's very interesting. And one of the concepts that we'll talk about in the coming weeks is this concept called behavioral economics, which is this branch of economics that deals exactly with this particular question, which is, we know that humans respond to incentives. That is really kind of obvious. If a car is coming down the street, you don't cross the road, right? You wait for the car to pass, and then you cross, right? That's an incentive. I don't want to get run over. But when it comes to the more marginal sort of decisions, the decisions where there is no clear right or wrong, or better or worse, then you see sort of human incentives sort of behave in an interesting way. A good example of this that you'll read about in Freakonomics is this experience with an Israeli daycare where they were having a hard time with parents showing up late to pick their kids up. So the daycare center workers were having to stay later. It wasn't fun for them to have to stay after work. They wanted to go home. So what they decided to do was they would create a incentive mechanism that would, in their minds, reduce the incentive to show up late. An obvious one is a penalty, a fine. A monetary cost, which says that if you pick your child late up from daycare, we will charge you additional fees on top of what you're already paying to send your kid to daycare. So they put a relatively small fee, and after a while, the daycare noticed, much to their horror, that in fact the number of parents showing up to pick their kids up late increased. That in fact, parents responded to the fee by increasing the amount of times they were late. Now, aside from the possibility that there's no causation at all, that the incentive didn't increase or decrease, it just was happenstance that the parents started showing up late, aside from that possibility, what are other possibilities as to why a relatively small fee would cause parents to actually show up late more often, not less often? I'm not going to get too much into it because you're going to read about it in the chapter of Freakonomics, but it's just interesting. Again, to kind of think about economic incentives as something that we know matter, but we don't necessarily know why or how or in what specific ways they matter. And again, this is really where economics becomes very useful, because even though economics is trying to come up with a set of generalizable beliefs about human behavior, that is, that we want to come up with ways in which humans respond to incentives in ways that are generalizable, that we can say people tend to do this, right? So a good example of this is money. People tend to respond to money in similar ways. We certainly all have our own opinions on money, but for the most part, people tend to respond to incentives with respect to money in similar ways. We try to avoid incurring costs. We try to seek opportunity. Right? Generally speaking, that's the way it works. But in the Israeli daycare center, what you have is, in a sense, people behaving in the opposite of that potential incentive. And so that's very interesting and something that we'll talk about. In the 1800s, they had this situation with British prisoner ships that were being sent to Australia, where the incentive mechanism was simply the number of prisoners that showed up in Australia, dead or alive. So the British prisoner ship captains were paid basically on the number of bodies that showed up in Australia, whether they were alive or dead. There was no distinguishing between them. As a result, the British prisoner ship captains had little incentive to make sure that the conditions on board their ship were good for their prisoners, and there was no incentive for them to generally be taken care of. And so the British prisoner ship captains didn't take care of them. Terrible conditions on board the ships, and unfortunately a lot of prisoners died making the trip from Europe to Australia. There was a public outcry whenever this was unveiled, that this was what was going on, that there were all these prisoners dying on their way to Australia. As a result, the British government changed their policy, and instead, in a relatively straightforward way, you're probably already thinking about this, they said, well, it's not going to be the number of bodies, but it's going to be the number of alive people. So the British prisoner ship captains were instead paid not on the number of bodies, but on the number of alive bodies, which is, I think most of us would say a better sounding incentive mechanism. But this is important, right? This is, policy is all about trying to understand human incentives. If we're going to have a policy to create a better outcome. So if we want to, for example, talk about discrimination policy at workplaces, and we want to talk about which policies will actually reduce discrimination, it takes an understanding not only of discrimination, but also an understanding of what are the incentives in the workplace that create the opportunity for discrimination, and kind of understanding those and sort of working back from them. And sort of understanding that humans don't always respond to incentives in the ways that we think. And also, in fact, that sometimes when humans are responding to just pure incentives, it actually creates outcomes that may not necessarily be best for everyone in society. And so there's a lot of nuance here and a lot of kind of friction between what we think we know about the way humans behave and then kind of how humans behave. And this would be something that we continually come back to and talk about a lot. And then kind of one final example that I think is really interesting, the endangered species list, which of course is maintained by the U.S. government as well as alongside and in conjunction with several conservation groups and pro-animal groups, is a list that is supposed to reduce the speed at which animals are becoming extinct. In fact, they're supposed to. The goal, of course, is to do away with the threat of extinction. The idea is that an animal is put on the endangered species list. It sort of brings awareness that this animal is potentially going to be going extinct, and it also draws attention to the fact that habitat conservation is very important for this particular animal. The way the policy is actually set out, though, it has some unintended consequences. One of the most perhaps important is that if you own land that is designated as being the habitat of an endangered species, by law, you became responsible for that particular habitat. And at times this was a costly consideration, not only in terms of direct monetary costs, but also in terms of time. An example of this was in Oregon, where these farmers were having snow owl populations on their land who were then designated as endangered species. Unfortunately, what happened is because farmers saw the endangered species list as this additional cost to their farms, they would, in fact, adopt what came to be known as a policy of shoot, shovel, and shut up. I'm not going to go too much into that. You can imagine what shoot, shovel, and shut up means. But suffice it to say that we actually have some evidence there that the endangered species list actually increased the extinction rate of the white owl and, in fact, didn't decrease it. That we responded by changing parts of the law and making it more understanding of these particular situations. So that was dealt with, but it was dealt with by admitting, or at least acknowledging, that perhaps the initial incentive mechanism was bad, and therefore it's something that maybe we want to think about changing. You'll read about this in the Freakonomics chapter 1 that I'm going to assign for you after this lecture video, and you'll see this play out in a number of different ways. To see this kind of idea kind of brought completely forward, this idea of humans respond to incentives. Let's play a game. We call this the grade game. Okay, so if you look at this, what we call payoff matrix, you'll see that there are essentially 2 rows and 2 columns. Here you have a row, another row, a column, and then another column. The way that you think about this is that you are going to respond by choosing alpha or beta. Okay, so everybody in the class will choose alpha or beta, and then I will collect your responses. Of course, you have to imagine that you're doing this because we're not in class, but I will then collect your responses, and then I will randomly pair you with someone else in class who, of course, has also responded, alpha or beta. Once I randomize you into pairs, I will then see what your responses are. If you both pick alpha, then this means you both get B minuses. The way you read the payoffs is that you always get the first payoff, your pair always gets the second payoff. So again, if you both pick alpha, you both get B minuses. On the same token, if you both pick beta, then you both get B pluses. The interesting part is when you pick differently. So if you pick alpha, and your beta picks, or excuse me, if you pick alpha and your pair picks beta, then you get an A. Again, your payoff is always the first one. You get an A and they get a C plus. If you pick beta and they pick alpha, then you get a C plus and they get an A. So you can see it's sort of the opposite, right? So when you both pick alpha, you both get B minuses. When you both pick beta, you get B pluses. When one of you picks alpha and the other picks beta, whoever picks beta gets a C plus. Whoever picked alpha gets an A. Okay? So at this moment, what I'd like you to do is pause the lecture video and just look at this payoff matrix. Make sure you understand what's going on here and think about it. Think about what you would pick between alpha or beta. Imagine that we were in class right now. I asked you to write down alpha or beta, and imagine that your grade literally depended on simply your answer and someone's randomized pair put together. So think about that. Pause the video. Think about what you would pick. Okay? And then when we come into class on the 17th, this is how we're going to start class. We'll start class by talking about the grade game. Okay. In the previous grade game, when you were thinking about what you would pick between alpha or beta, what you did was you created what we call a heuristic. You created a heuristic not only for yourself, but you also created a heuristic for your pair. Even though you don't know who your pair is, you know nothing about them, you created a heuristic. Now here, the heuristic is relatively simple. The heuristic is simply the outcomes of the game, and your probable assumption that you and your pair are behaving in your own self-interest. Simply meaning that you and your pair are trying to get the highest grade possible. You know, you have complete information. You know exactly what grade you'll get when you choose what you choose and what your pair chooses. So you can safely assume that the both of you are simply trying to maximize your grade, right? That's your goal. Get the highest grade possible. When we say what a heuristic is, we mean it's a mental model that we use to make predictions. We think about what we think will occur, and then we make predictions based upon that. In a sense, we're creating a theory. And oftentimes we don't get a chance to test the theory. We just see the theory, whether it plays out or not. In this scenario, when we talk about the grade game the next time we meet in class, we'll see how this game is likely to sort of play out, and we'll talk about why it's likely to play out that way. But the point here is to say that this idea of creating within your head a model of human behavior is something that you naturally do. It's something that you do instinctively. Go back to what I said previously about crossing the road. You naturally understand that before you cross the road, you should look both ways because you don't want to get hit by a car, right? That's a natural heuristic. You create a framework. Basically, the framework says the decision of whether I will cross the street or not will be determined by my belief about my chances of getting run over. If my belief about my chances of getting run over are low enough, then I will cross the street. However, if my belief about my chances of getting run over are in fact high enough, that in fact I think if I cross the street I might get hit, I'm not going to cross the street. I've created a heuristic, which then allows me to make predictions about relative probabilities. this all sounds very complicated, but essentially what it means is that everything exists as a probability. And sometimes you can do things to increase probabilities. So reduce the probability of getting hit by a car by looking both ways. Sometimes you can increase the probability of things. Increase the probability of being hit by a car by not looking both ways. This is ultimately how we're going to think about the concept of rationality. We're going to think about the fact that whenever we're trying to define whether something is or is not rational, we're simply creating a heuristic and applying our own, perhaps, subjective definition of rationality. And this is important when it comes time to design economic systems or design the policies that are meant to interact within that economic system. We're always thinking about heuristic creation and predictions. When policymakers create policies, what they're doing is they make predictions about behaviors. I think businesses will react this way to a tax cut. I think criminals will react this way to stiffer penalties. Whatever it is, you're trying to create predictions about behavior. If I own a business, my marketing is a response to predictions about human behavior. I market myself in a way that I think will increase people coming to my business. Therefore, I'm making a prediction about what I think people will be enticed by. And so, again, this seems like a relatively complicated concept, but it really isn't. And we do it so naturally that it really just takes a little bit of reflection on our own part to realize that we're doing this. And so this is all about kind of can we make predictions, and then are those predictions generalizable? In other words, are the predictions we made about person A similar to the predictions we made about person B, which would then be similar to the predictions about person C. The more generalizable our heuristic, the better it tends to be, the more flexible it tends to be. If our heuristic only works for a certain set of individuals, then that limits the applicability of our heuristic, but doesn't necessarily limit its usefulness. For example, if I'm a company and I'm thinking about marketing, I may try to market to distinct groups of individuals differently. I may try to market to old customers in a particular way while trying to market to young customers in a completely different way. That's fine. Oftentimes, however, we find it useful to have generalizable heuristics that apply to as broad a population as possible, whether that's with respect to marketing or whether that's with respect to governmental policy, or sort of a whole host of issues. Again, this brings up conversations about rationality. This will be, in fact, one of the kind of first conversations we have about in the course will be sort of what is rationality. So we're going to talk about these issues a lot more on the first day of class that we actually see each other. But what is rationality but simply a heuristic used to make predictions about human behavior? But the issue is that we're very biased in how we see human behavior for a whole number of reasons. We tend to see patterns that don't actually exist. This is most easily described by what we call the hot hand fallacy. So if you're someone who watches sports, or even if you're not, you can understand that whenever you're watching sports, it will at times appear as if someone has a really hot hand. In other words, in a basketball game, someone may seem to make a lot of shots in a row, and as a result, we tend to sort of project onto them a belief about their current probability of making a shot, and we put that probability to be very high. But the fact is that whether you just made a shot doesn't necessarily affect the probability that you'll make the next shot. But from our visual perspective, it seems like it does. And so this is what we call the hot hand fallacy. There are all sorts of other biases that affect our perceptions of rationality, and we'll talk about these more as we go through. Another good example is loss aversion. What I mean by loss aversion is that people really attach a large weight to losing something, and so as a result, we tend to value what we have greater than that we don't. In other words, oftentimes, if someone buys something for, say, $20, they will often need more than $20 to part with that particular product, even though they just paid $20 for it, because there's some sort of detachment, uncomfortability that occurs. We don't like to lose things, and so therefore we will tend to place a greater value on losing them than we did on obtaining them. And so this is just interesting and allows us to think about human behavior and really the sort of cognitive side of economic decision making in a really interesting way. And then the kind of bigger point, and we'll talk about this more in class, is that biases make rationality very hard, nearly impossible to define. One particular issue that sort of gets at this question is this concept called framing. And again, we're kind of doing all of this in the context of that heuristic design we were just talking about. The way that framing works is that the way that we see situations is not agnostic to what we just experienced. And so here's a really good example of that. Mr. Crane and Mr. Tees are scheduled to leave the airport on different flights, but at the same time. They've traveled from town in the same limousine, were caught in the same traffic jam, and arrived at their airport 30 minutes after the scheduled departure time of their flight. So they both missed their flight, and they both missed their flight by 30 minutes. Mr. Crane is told that his flight left on time, so he was 30 minutes late to catch his flight. Mr. Tees is told his flight was delayed, but unfortunately left 5 minutes ago, so meaning that he was ultimately 25 minutes, or excuse me, he was 30 minutes late, but ultimately was only 5 minutes late for what was his delayed flight. So the question is, who's more upset? Now, the reality is that they both missed their flight. Mr. Crane and Mr. Tees are in the exact same situation. They have missed their flight. But many people will respond to this by saying that Mr. Tees will be more upset, because while Mr. Crane also missed his flight, Mr. Tees only just barely missed his flight. And this, for whatever reason, makes humans more upset. There is a conditionality, There's sort of a conditional nature to how we perceive situations. So in a sense, we can imagine that Mr. Crane will certainly be upset about missing his flight, but that Mr. Tees may in fact be more upset over just missing his flight. And I think that's just kind of a really interesting example to think about. Another sort of component of decision-making and heuristic design is how humans think about the concept of opportunity cost. And what I mean by that is that opportunity cost is the value of the next best alternative. It's the sort of what you're giving up whenever you make a particular decision. And here's a good example with respect to studying. So imagine that there is a direct causal effect for studying and your grade, meaning that the more you study, the higher your grade is, and that we actually know the exact causal mechanism. And that is that for every 2 hours of studying per week, your grade rises by 1 level. So if you don't do any studying, you get an F. You do 2 hours of studying, you get a D. 4 hours of studying, C, so on and so forth. And so 8 hours of studying is going to get you that A. Okay? So the question, therefore, is how expensive is watching Netflix in the context of grades, right? So when we say expensive here, we mean this in the context of grades. So that in and of itself is kind of an interesting setup. Instead of, typically when we say expensive, we mean it with respect to money. Here we're saying expensive in the context of grades. It's probably completely rational to do that. We may ask a question like, how much studying does Netflix become free? So after how much have I studied, can I then sort of stress-free watch Netflix without worrying about it affecting my grade? Since we already sort of established that 8 hours of studying gets you that A, for 8 hours of studying, and then after that you can watch as much Netflix as you want, and it won't affect your grade. So there's a general lesson here for you to consider, but the point is that opportunity cost, that is what we give up when we make decisions, factors into our decision making. And again, this is something that we already do. Now, we may argue that at times we pay more attention or less attention to opportunity cost than we should. This will be something that we'll talk about as well. But the point here is that opportunity cost is a part of our economic decision-making. Here, that economic decision-making is how should we spend our time. But this would be applicable to where do we go eat lunch? What college major did I choose? All of those decisions that lead us down one path that take us away from another path. We're always comparing the two paths. And if I go down path A, I probably have at least thought about going down path B and what it would mean if I went down path B. And then sort of we get, again, kind of a very interesting set of economic considerations when we start thinking about that. This gets even more interesting when we introduce the idea that we know that two paths exist, A and B, but we don't necessarily know what the outcomes of those paths are. So you introduce the concept of uncertainty, things get a lot more interesting. The other thing that we think about in economics is we tend to think on the margin. That is, when decisions are being made, how much more studying should I do? How much Netflix should I watch? How many oranges should I eat? We're doing so by thinking about that next incremental amount. This is a little bit distinct for economists to think this way, so it's one of the things that we point out. This is important because it sheds light on one of the most important concepts in all of economics, and that's the law of diminishing marginal returns. When we think on the margin, one of the things that we notice is that as we continually do a particular behavior, the gains from that behavior tend to fall off, or in fact go negative at a certain point. So a good example of this, a good example of diminishing marginal returns would be buying a big bag of oranges versus, say, buying individual oranges. If I buy the big bag of oranges, what can happen is that before I get to all the oranges, before they start going bad, I may get tired of them. Because as I eat my first orange, I really enjoyed it. I eat the second orange, I enjoyed it maybe a little bit less than the first orange. I get to the third orange, and at a certain point, I just don't want any more oranges. I'm tired of oranges. So there's a diminishing marginal returns nature to consumption often. And not just consumption, but even something like production. Businesses often find it that simply hiring more and more labor, for example, and sticking that labor into a factory at a certain point may actually reduce the amount of products that are made. Mainly just because of the physical space nature of sort of humans taking up space and getting in the way of each other. You can't simply just put as many factory workers and expect it'll just increase the amount of products that you make. So there's this diminishing returns aspect to a lot of behaviors. And so therefore, economists believe that we should think on the margin, that we should really consider kind of incremental changes. And again, this is something that we'll come back to repeatedly in class. We can think about thinking on the margin in the context of tax policy, for example. Like, does it make sense for us to cut taxes? So instead of thinking about the sort of cutting taxes broadly, we think about, okay, what is the current tax rate? If we cut taxes, what is going to be that incremental change in consumer or firm behavior? And once we understand that, does the tax cut make sense, or is the tax cut kind of say perhaps do very little? And again, this is all stuff that we're going to get to, but I want you to kind of think about thinking on the margin and what that would mean in terms of decision making. Think about this in the context of, having a few drinks with friends. At a certain point, it would be nice if, drinking alcohol, sort of told us this is the diminishing returns, like don't have maybe the next drink. But alcohol, because it messes, it sort of gets involved, gets in the way of our cognitive, pathways, actually turns that aspect off. And that's why people tend to overdrink. And so even though behavior may lead us to overconsume at times, it still is readily available to us to see the diminishing value of continued or increased behavior in one particular way. All right. Maybe the perhaps most important component of what we might call markets. So a lot of what we've described up to this point has been sort of individual human behavior, whether it was, kind of humans respond to incentives, or whether it was opportunity cost, or whether it was thinking on the margin. These are all kind of thinking in individual ways. But markets really work because there are mutual benefits, because people engage in transactions because they both benefit on either side of that transaction. I go to a store and I buy a box of cereal. I wanted the cereal and the store wants my money. So there's a mutual benefit going on there. It's not the case in healthy markets that people are not having mutual benefits. If there's a situation where someone is being exploited, for example, then that's not a healthy economic market, and that's often calls for policy intervention and various other forms of market intervention. So generally speaking, humans endeavor to exchange that which they have, whether that's skills or whether that's money, or whether that's advice, for example, and exchange that for that which they want. So I have something, I want to exchange it for something that I want. This creates incentives to exchange money, objects, labor hours, so that we may pursue our own benefits. People toil away at jobs for hours upon hours, and we may ask ourselves at times, why do they do it? Paying the bills is certainly one component, but there's also this other idea that I will spend my time working so that I can earn a living and therefore pursue my own passions or pursue my own things that make me happy. And so this is where this idea of kind of what Adam Smith saw when he talked about the invisible hand of the market was that markets create these incentives that cause us to behave in ways that then benefit everyone. In fact, you'll often hear this argument with respect to, what is the benefits of markets? Well, one of the benefits of markets is that it creates incentives for humans to behave in ways that benefit other humans. So there tends to be these kind of positive spillovers that occur when markets are formed. And it's actually one of the really sort of beautiful aspects of economic systems that they sort of can spread prosperity. Now, of course, this doesn't always work, and that will be a core component of the course, is for us to discuss when markets fail and when they don't create sort of a spreading of prosperity about an economy, but in fact when they work almost in the opposite. So, but the basic idea here is that sort of economists believe crucially in the idea of mutual benefits, and that's kind of how markets are supposed to work. And so in situations where there's a lack of mutual benefits, we'll tend to see those markets break down, or at the very least we would expect those markets to not create much in terms of broad social benefit. Okay. And then, to sort of like get us towards the end, already gone a little bit longer than I wanted to on this, but, there's a lot to discuss here. And again, this is sort of making up for that first day of class, so, it probably takes a little bit of expounding upon. What you're looking at here is what sort of my own interpretation of what we might call the circular flow. The idea behind the circular flow is that consumption and production create the circular nature of our economic system. Households consume, they send money and labor to firms. The firms then produce things as well as create wages for employees and then send those back to the households. You also have government enterprises inside there. You have political, legal, and economic structures kind of working internally. You have money flowing about the economy. You have money growing about the economy. And then one other component that I think is crucial is that also there are things being spit out of the circular flow. Pollution, resource exhaustion, waste. These issues will be very important for conversations later as to the general efficacy of how markets operate. So we'll actually look at things like pollution as a way for us to contextualize the social benefit of a market. If a market is producing a lot of money for its producers, its firms, and people are really enjoying buying from that market. A good example of this would be the iPhone. Apple makes a lot of money from iPhones. People love iPhones, but they are the cobalt that specifically that is used inside of iPhones is very environmentally damaging, for example. And so the question then becomes, how much is the benefit of iPhones obscuring the environmental degradation that is coming from the production of iPhones? And how much should we consider of that environmental degradation into maybe the price of an iPhone? Or at the very least, to contextualize what we see as the economic benefits of an iPhone. So maybe we consider that the pollution may in fact reduce the overall benefits of a market. And that therefore this then plays into policies and governmental sort of interventions perhaps in the future within the context of the economic system. And of course a lot of this has to do with the various incentives that policymakers as well as firms and households find themselves in, and those incentives that cause us to behave in particular ways. We all have companies that we prefer to buy from. We have food and products that we prefer to buy, and we have those preferences for a whole host of reasons. Some of you may buy products from companies because they're socially conscious. Some of you may not buy products from companies because you think they're being political. There's all sorts of reasons for why we do or don't engage in trade with private companies. And that oftentimes presents these really interesting discussions about the ways in which economics kind of plays out, not only in our kind of private life, but also as well as in our public life when we start thinking about the context of kind of society at large. So, how well is economics, how well is economic growth, in terms of actually spreading economic, opportunity to everybody in our economic system. In other words, how well is this circular flow doing at spreading sort of economic prosperity? Economists believe in markets because we think they do good. We don't believe in markets because we think they make a lot of money for corporate fat cats and that's the reason why they're good. No, in fact, we think that markets are good because if in a sense, if they're healthy, then they should create prosperity on both sides, both in terms of the producer and also in terms of the consumer. And additionally, when we think about markets, we can't kind of ignore that they may create these negative spillovers or maybe even positive spillovers, in the context of, something like, environmental pollution, or a positive spillover could be a flu vaccination. So when I get the flu vaccine, this actually reduces your potential for getting the flu. And so sometimes our economic behavior overlaps with other people's outcomes, and our economic behavior colors what happens in other people's lives. I mean, when you see this in the context of international trade, in the ways in which American consumer behavior leads to these outcomes for citizens in other countries, either by providing these individuals gainful employment, perhaps, or maybe in fact these individuals find themselves in exploitative economic situations where their labor is being taken advantage of, and they're not properly being compensated for their work. Meanwhile, we're sort of consuming products that benefit us, and so there's a lot of potential tension there that manifests itself and gives us a lot to talk about in this course. And so, I've been talking for 52 minutes. I could talk for probably 4 more hours about these issues. I will not. But as you can probably already see, there's so much for us to kind of cover here, that, it's exciting, but also probably a little bit daunting. We're going to skip this next slide. We're going to talk about this in class, when we meet. So no worries there just yet. All right. So in closing, we can say this about markets. Good systems align self-benefit with public benefit. That is, systems that work well, when we go back to this, systems, circular flow systems that work generally well are systems that align self-benefit with public benefit. In other words, I undertake private endeavors that ultimately benefit society at large. And again, markets seem to be at least somewhat of a good way to do this. Markets may maximize public benefit by maximizing self-benefits. This is, in a sense, kind of the hope. That is, that if people do or pursue their own economic freedom, this will in turn lead to a prosperity that spreads throughout society. This doesn't always work. In fact, it may not often work. It's, one of the unfortunate aspects of our economic system. It's certainly the goal. Most people tend to kind of like believe it would be nice if it occurred, but oftentimes we see for various reasons, prosperity tends to stick. Rich people, spend money. The idea is that money then kind of makes its way throughout the economic system, and it certainly does to a certain extent, although depending upon certain public policies, tax policies, that money may or may not flow very far. So it may make its way down a little bit, but may not make its way down there. And we see this, with the fact that, wage stagnation has been here for the last couple of decades. People aren't generally making any more money than they were 20, 30 years ago. At the same time, the economic system has grown considerably. And so we have to ask ourselves, okay, maybe the circular flow does a good job of growing the pie, but we have not done a very good job of making sure the pie is at least somewhat fair. And again, we'll kind of have conversations about equity versus efficiency. Sometimes if you want a more equitable system, you have to give up an efficient system, but also vice versa. And sometimes a lack of efficiency may cause increases in equity, and the same goes both ways. So that will be one of the relationships that we really talk about. The fact is that, again, sometimes markets create problems because we don't necessarily see all of the benefits and costs that they create. So there's these sort of spillovers that can sometimes go outside of markets. And so even when we have consumers that are factoring in all these various things, they're thinking on the margin, they're considering their opportunity costs, they're responding to incentives, even still, markets can at times create these situations where there are costs or benefits being experienced outside of a market. And we'll see when we go through the class, the sort of problems that this might create, and also the opportunities that it creates with respect to public policy in terms of actually maybe achieving a greater level of benefit to the public at large. Anyway. So I've talked too much for this first lecture slide show. But anyway, this is a nice introduction to the course, I think, in terms of it kind of gets a lot of maybe some of these sort of more philosophical questions sort of out of the way. We're going to come back to these philosophical questions throughout the course. We will constantly be sort of talking about whether markets often align self and public interest. We'll talk about equity and efficiency concerns and so on and so forth. Constantly be brought back up. But it's good for us to get some of this terminology out of the way. What we're going to do in class the next time we meet, we're going to basically spend the time kind of talking about behavioral economics, and talking about how human behavior is at times a confounding but also useful way for us to understand the potential of markets and also the potential problems of markets. So anyway, I will see you in class soon.